Welcome to this webinar on COVID-19 and Asia-Pacific security, regional experiences and implications for Canada. This is the first event organized by the Asia-Pacific team of the Defense and Security Foresight Group. I'm Stéphanie Martel. I am an assistant professor at Queen's University in the Department of Political Studies, and I'm a fellow at the Center for International and Defense Policy. I will have the pleasure of moderating our distinguished panel, and I'm also the co-lead with Ryan Job of the Asia-Pacific team within the DSF group, the Defense and Security Foresight Group. So before I move to introduce our panel, I wanted to just briefly introduce the network itself and what our team, the Asia-Pacific team, does within that broader network. And here you can see a slide with some general information on the network itself, the DSF group, and how it's organized. So the DSF group is a newly launched network of academics across Canada and abroad, with some participants abroad. And the aim of this network is to provide foresight on important defense and security issues impacting Canada. Our network is funded by the Department of National Defense through its Mobilizing Insights in Defense and Security program, also known as MINDS. The DSF group has 5 thematic themes, which you can see on the screen, including on the Asia Pacific, as well as kind of a cross-team or cross-sectoral team on gender-based analysis plus, working in close collaboration with all of the thematic teams. So the slide you see provides some information, particularly on the co-leads for each team. But if you wish to have more information on the network and the team members associated with each team or the mandate of these respective thematic teams, you can find more details about that on the website of the DSF group hosted by the University of Waterloo. And you can also follow the network's activities on Twitter at DSF_group. And within this broad network, the Asia Pacific team in particular consists of 10 Canadian experts in addition to a broader set of collaborators. And the team covers a broad spectrum of regional security issues, from the evolution of regional order in the midst of major power rivalry to unconventional security challenges that are non-military or transnational in nature, to interstate conflict and the intersection of gender and security. Our experts also focus on various sub-regions of Asia, including Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Central Asia. And you can find more information on the profiles of our experts and their recent publications too on the team's dedicated webpage on the DSFG website. So today's event, just to give you a little bit of context, is the last webinar of a series of webinars organized by the DSF group this summer. So if you missed prior webinars, they have been recorded, so will be this one. And all of these webinars, the recordings are available again on the DSFG website. So a driving question of today's discussion in particular is how COVID-19 impacts the regional security landscape in the Asia Pacific, what the implications are for Canada's engagement in the region. And so to provide more clarity on this question, we have the pleasure of having 4 leading Canadian experts on Asia-Pacific security with us. And these experts will discuss this broad question from very various and distinct angles. And as you can expect, there are a lot of dimensions hidden behind that general question. So before we get to the bottom of all of this, I want to introduce our panelists. So first we have Jennifer Mustafa. Dr. Mustafa is an assistant professor at Huron College University at Western Her research focuses on the role of ideas and institutions in regional governance. Her recent book, titled Writing Southeast Asian Security, Regional Security and the War on Terror After 9/11, just came out last year with Routledge. Next, we have Sean Narayan, which you can see on the screen, I think, right now. He's a professor of international relations at St. Thomas University. His research focuses on institutions in the Asia-Pacific region. He has written several books and articles on ASEAN, human rights in Southeast Asia, China's civil-military relations, among a variety of other topics. His current research focuses on Canada's current relations with China, which I believe is on everyone's mind getting into this panel. Brian Jobe next is a professor of political science at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at UBC. Dr. Jobe co-leads the Asia-Pacific team with me within the DSF group. His research is on international security in the Asia-Pacific, Canadian foreign and security policy, and human security and peacekeeping. Dr. Jobe has been also actively involved in Track 2 diplomacy in the Asia-Pacific for many years. And finally, we have Jeff Reeves. Jeff Reeves is Vice President of Research for the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada. His work covers a broad range of topics having to do with the economics, politics, and security of East Asia. He has published several books on China-Japan relations, China's foreign policy, and non-traditional security in Asia. So thank you all to our panelists for being with us today. Before I throw my first question at our panel, a few notes on process. So we'll start with an exchange between the panelists and myself, and then we'll open up the discussion to a Q&A with the audience. So when the time comes, the audience will be able to ask questions by typing them directly into the Q&A section at the right bottom of your screen. So you can use the little click on the Q&A to have the menu kind of unroll there, and you can type your questions, which I will be able to see. I will draw from the pool of questions there to convey some of the questions from the audience to the panelists during the second half of that event. So I would ask the audience to wait on that second half, for that second half to start before typing their questions. But if you do have a more immediate request for clarification, feel free to use that feature as well, and I will make sure that your question gets to the panelists in question. So my first question is a general one. And I want to throw this general question to our panel for them to each offer a different perspective on this general question for about 5 minutes for a first round to kind of set the stage for discussion. So that first question would be, what are some of the key implications that you see of COVID-19 on the Asia-Pacific regional security landscape? Is COVID-19 creating new challenges, exacerbating existing ones, changing how different actors should approach security in this region, or all of the above? So I'll let the panelists kind of give general introduction remarks before we move to more specific questions. So I'd like to start with Sean Narayan, because Sean Narayan's work has been focusing on kind of the general geostrategic landscape, and particularly with a particular interest in big power rivalry. So I'm hoping that you can kind of launch the discussion for us a little bit, Sean, with your remarks. You have to unmute yourself.
There, now can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Well, Stephanie, you phrased this in the form of a question. As you know, I wrote up a little blurb, which I don't think quite works that well. So let me try to answer your question in a more informal way. Well, first off, I think all of the above to respond to your initial question. A couple of things that I've sort of focused on when I was thinking about this is, does the COVID-19 situation, what does it say about the American role in the larger Asia Pacific? And when I was thinking about this and writing about it, the point that I tried to make is that I think the American failure to manage the COVID-19 crisis, um, on the one hand, it's definitely somewhat unique. I think we can imagine circumstances under which a different president would have handled this very differently, even a different Republican president. But at the same time, I think it's very pertinent that Donald Trump was elected at all. And the reason I raise this is because the argument I make is that the United States has had a series of very significant failures as a hegemonic power over the past 25 years. And this coronavirus situation is the most recent and perhaps the most substantial manifestation of significant problems within the American state, with particularly domestically, but those domestic limitations have major implications on its ability to be an effective and reliable hegemon. And I suspect that across the region, this is something that regional states are becoming to realize. We can discuss that in a bit more depth later, but I think that the recognition that the Americans have fumbled this so terribly is a problem for American reliability and American hegemonic status. So that's one point I would make. The second point is that I don't think that China has gained from this as much as you may have thought, that the coronavirus has had, obviously, China has been severely criticized for its mishandling of the initial coronavirus problem. And at the same time, even though it's managed to get the problem under control, it still has to face the fact that a lot of international anger is being directed towards it. Whether fairly or not, the fact remains that the coronavirus emanated from China and is having catastrophic consequences in many places. So a lot of governments around the world are going to, again, fairly or not, direct the anger and the concern about what's happening towards China. And China doesn't have any easy way to respond to that. It doesn't help that some of its of the PPE, of the medical gear that it's been sending out to different places in the world, where it's hoping to gain some kind of soft power credit for its actions, some of that gear has proven to be not particularly reliable. And so that's undermined the Chinese position a bit too. But I think more importantly, one of the reasons China has not gained that much from this situation is China doesn't have the kind of soft power that the United States does. It doesn't have a universalist ideology it's trying to promote. And so right off the bat, it's disadvantaged. So the Americans might be faltering, but the Chinese cannot simply move into that vacuum and fill it. The second problem is that for geographical reasons, China is surrounded by countries with which it has different kinds of conflicts. And so just inherently, that makes them weary. And so I think that what we're seeing with the coronavirus situation, and I would argue this decline in American capability, is that these China, we're entering a true multipolar world where no power can dominate if anyone ever could, but it's becoming clearer what those lines are. And finally, and hopefully I haven't gone over 5 minutes, I'll end by saying that I think in Canada's case, we need to be very careful not to be dragged into an American Cold War with China. That's not to our advantage. It's not to our interests. For one reason, Asia is a major source of immigration to Canada that has some significant demographic implications as well as political implications. But also more than that, Asia is probably the future, the future of the world economy, maybe the future of a lot of world technology. And for Canada to cut itself off or to get drawn into confrontational politics when we don't need to be, I think is counterproductive for us.
Thank you, Sean. And you're just below the 5-minute limit. So excellent. It's a good start for us. So I want to move to Jeff Reeves to kind of provide a little bit more information on how I anticipate some specific countries have dealt with the COVID-19 situation, because I know that the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada has been conducting a lot of very good work on this. So hopefully we can get a little bit more on the domestic politics and the implications of COVID-19 on national security. So Jeff, to you.
Sure, thanks so much. Let me see if I can pull up my notes. Absolutely, I'll address the national level, but just to make a couple comments with respect to what Sean said, which mostly I agree with. I think the real threat that COVID is facing, and we can think about it in the Asia Pacific, is a threat to the existing regional order in a lot of ways, right? With the delegitimization of the United States in the region, I think we're seeing a rollback of democracy, which was already was already in process before COVID. We saw a move away from democracy at the national level, more towards mixed models in some instances with extremes of authoritarianism in some states. But I think now what COVID is essentially doing is helping that process move further along. So at the national level, we are seeing a crisis of democracy. I think that the United States and some of its partner countries understand that. When you look at the Indo-Pacific concepts, or the free and open Indo-Pacific concepts coming out of places like Australia and Japan and the United States, pro-democracy or democratic promotion is essential to that. So there is, I think, an understanding that democracy is in retreat within the Asia-Pacific. I would disagree a little bit with Sean on the fact that I do think that China has gotten a bit of a rise from its response to COVID. I think that it did get early criticisms of not reporting the outbreak of a novel coronavirus to the WHO fast enough. But I think since then it's demonstrated a very effective response at the national level. And if the early economic data that we're seeing coming out of China are true, what we're going to also see is that my guess is that China gets a rise in its regional standing because it will have been seen to have navigated the economic aspects of this more effectively than other states in the region. And I think that, compounding that with its response to the 2008 and 2009 global financial crisis, once more, while China isn't, out trying to get people to sign up to a China model, it is demonstrating a degree of effectiveness that I think will have long-term effects on regional governance. That said, at the more state level, I think we've seen a number of things with respect to kind of the hard security aspect. I think early in March, the United Nations Accords came forward and said that they were advocating for a COVID ceasefire. There were a couple small groups in the region that signed up for that. The New People's Army in the Philippines, the BRN in southern Thailand, both came forward and said that they were open to that possibility, and initially entered into kind of soft treaties with their respective national government. Those have since fallen apart. So one of the things that we've seen is that was a lost opportunity, in particular because the central governments didn't seem to buy into this model of providing space to groups within their sovereign territory to essentially consolidate themselves and consolidate their power. So there wasn't a real buy-in from the state side with respect to those COVID ceasefires. So what I think we can anticipate seeing at the national level is kind of a further erosion of state-society relations in areas that are ungoverned or that are outside of the kind of mandate of the state, or where states aren't able to affect sovereign control. So in places like Myanmar, in Thailand, in the Philippines, we could potentially see a resurgence of localized conflict between non-state groups and the state. I think one very interesting part to track at the state level also is the rush for new legislation that's meant to deal with the outbreak, but that could ultimately end up strengthening the state against the societies. China is the best example of that. Of course, that's not new for COVID, but China has put, I think, more legislation and more, especially around the adoption and the use of technology, that have long-term effects on state-society relations. So states across the region right now are rushing to implement tighter controls on people's movements, on group activities, and on economic life without actually thinking through the social implications, right? So I think that will be a long-term trend that we see at the national level that's a result of COVID as well. And I think the last point that I would make is we haven't actually seen this yet, but I think we can anticipate seeing pretty significant human security implications around economic loss and opportunities, which I'm happy to talk about later when we get into the economic specifics of this. But I do think that is an emerging problem that's going to be happening not just in the Asia Pacific, but globally because of this pandemic.
Thank you, Jeff. So moving now to Jennifer Mustafa. which I believe could serve as a good complement to Jeff's remarks on the domestic context.
Hi, thanks everyone. So I'm echoing some of what's been said, but I'm going to comment more specifically about Southeast Asia in particular. So Southeast Asian states are in a lot of ways already well positioned sort of individually to navigate shifts in great power dynamics and to face, big changes in regional or global order that might be brought on in the context of COVID-19. Southeast Asian actors, out of necessity, have long honed a lot of the skills, one might say, required to navigate tricky relationships, thorny, controversial issues, and so on. And they've also, designed and continue to interact in regional associations like ASEAN to allow for a lot of informal and flexible dealings with each other and with external powers. On the other hand, because of the same feature of regional institutions like ASEAN, Southeast Asian actors as a group are often critiqued about struggling to formulate, a coherent regional response to things like a pandemic or to any other, recent regionally significant crisis or security issue, if we're being honest. Now that said, there is some evidence to the contrary. Sarah Davies from Griffiths in Australia wrote a book about the politics of disease outbreaks in Asia that actually came out before the COVID crisis. And I was listening to a talk by her the other day, and she talked about how ASEAN World Health Organization actually had, they embarked upon a sort of partnership. Again, this was pre-COVID. In terms of trying to make sure that ASEAN countries had international health regulation compliance, and a lot of the ASEAN countries subjected themselves to external review. And this, of course, was in response to the H5N1 and SARS disease pandemics. And one of the observations that came out of that work was that that might have had a positive effect on the fact that a lot of the local actors were, state actors specifically, did have kind of a rapid and arguably fairly cohesive response to COVID in the region, if we are going to compare it to, say, what we see in the United States, and even some of the stuff that happened in Europe as well. Now, that being said, obviously there are complexities there, and they continue to navigate that. Generally, something that has always been true about Asian relations is, especially in that part of the region, is the degree to which they're always walking tight ropes in their relationships with each other and with the US and with China, as the other two panelists have said already. So in some respects, nothing much has changed on that front. But in other respects, we're going to see an escalation and a continuation of some of those same tensions emerge as well. We've been hearing a lot about the new Cold War that might be emerging. And then, a question that a lot of actors in Southeast Asia have is, to what degree are we going to get pulled into that, or do we not have a choice? And then I think that is also a question for Canada, which we'll talk about later. The other point worth mentioning is, of course, that there is a darker side of national success stories of handling the COVID pandemic. And this is, of course, one of the biggest challenges for Southeast Asian regional security, if we define it more broadly than just the sort of state level or state society conflict. State interests alone do not necessarily guarantee the safety and security of populations and groups that are subject to state power, many of which are finding themselves even more affected by what we might call the unjust exercise of power by ruling elites. And this is something that I think Jeff was gesturing towards as well. So either because COVID is a distraction, or because COVID response is a catalyst for power consolidation through expanded emergency powers, as we've seen recently in the Philippines, for example, importantly, and I think this is important to mention, this is true for all states, not just Asia, but we're looking at Asia right now. And one of the things that sort of the Southeast Asian governments are known for, both in policy and in literature, whether we're talking about the democratic ones or not, is the sort of strong state disposition, right? So we are seeing a little bit of that rollback in, state-society relations that way. And we see this disconnect between, what is good for ruling governments and what is good for the people. So more specifically, of course, we continue to see issues in Myanmar. The COVID crisis has actually escalated, the risk being faced by, for example, the Rohingya population. Not only are we seeing an escalation of persecution within Myanmar, but we're seeing an escalation of human rights violations against them by countries who would be receiving them as refugees, or even as, foreign nationals or foreign labor. And so, for example, there are 180,000 Rohingya people in Malaysia. And unfortunately, the Rohingya people have, in some respects, been scapegoated as carriers and bringers of COVID, even as they remain a very high-risk population for actually catching COVID because of some of these detention practices. We're also seeing escalation of gender-based violence in the region that's linked directly to COVID lockdown and COVID response and economic effects from COVID. That has been charted as well. We're seeing an escalation of hate speech and incitement against minority groups or against other Asian groups within Asian countries, notably against people of Chinese descent all over Southeast Asia. And, as I think Jeff mentioned, the Philippines has become a bit of a sort of exemplar of some of the things that can occur under the auspices of, emergency response. So we have seen, the new anti-terrorism law, which is sort of a catch-all. It seeks to address the drug, issues, the CPP NDF issues. And then we also have a situation right now where there are clan wars happening among MILF commanders, both current and foreign, which has actually caused the displacement of up to 12,000 people in Mindanao. So there's lots of different things going on. I think we're seeing this uptick in discriminatory practices against both minorities and foreign nationals. And it's important to note that this is happening everywhere and is not unique to Asia. But it is something that, I'm concerned about when I look at, what is the regional kind of implication with regards to COVID. And I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Jennifer. So now turning to Brian Job.
Thank you, and good morning. I'm happy to join colleagues in our audience in discussing the impact of COVID-19 on Canada's Asia-Pacific security issues. And I'll keep my remarks directed mainly towards Canada with some observations about the region that others have already touched upon. And I'll look to make 2 points in this first round. And the first concerns the roles and responsibilities of national militaries. And I'd argue that with the pandemic, we've seen new responsibilities and expectations for military forces. Like all regional militaries, the Canadian military is designed to respond to emergencies at home and abroad. And it has unique institutional planning and resilience. And these were fully apparent in response to the COVID pandemic. The pandemic, however, posed a different spectrum of threats in that military forces, in order to sustain their national security functions and to respond to the needs of their governments and populations, had to first protect themselves from the virus. And I think we have to keep that point in mind. This has led to 2 avenues of response for Canada. One was a dramatic reorientation of ongoing operations of the forces. Training, transfer, supply were halted, curtailed. Deployments were deferred, for instance, to Northeast Asian waters. Multilateral operations like RIMPAC were canceled or postponed. Now, but for other Asia-Pacific militaries, I'm not sure that's the case. And indeed, one analyst point to China's intensifying its military activities in the region rather than diminishing them. And for the US, perhaps a more open question, but certainly a lot of activity recently in the region. So Canada may be a bit distinctive in that regard. My second issue here is that notably these roles and expectations have expanded on the Canadian military, both in frequency and scope. And in particular, the forces face multiple requests for domestic assistance. Now, in most states, this involved logistical support, monitoring, and surveillance. But in Canada, this was extended to disease control in civilian care facilities. The bulk of our military medical corps, 1,600 persons or so, assigned in Ontario and Quebec, both to deliver and, I think, of special note, to evaluate and report on the civilian facilities in question. And I think that's unique within the Asia-Pacific region. Other militaries have been involved in surveillance and monitoring and logistical activities, but I don't know of any other than where the military runs the country itself that has happened. Certainly not in our sort of peer group. Overall, I think one of the comments to be made listening to my colleagues is that Asian states and Canada responded relatively well to COVID. And indeed, what is notable is the success of the very different national strategies that countries have employed. There are positive and negative aspects to that, but by and large, Asian countries come out of this looking much better, say, than their counterparts in the Americas, for instance. The exception, of course, the United States. My second point then is, what are the challenges and opportunities moving forward? Well, the task for Canada, for the moment, for the Canadian forces, as their senior officials are stating, is getting back to work. But this is not going to be work as it was. The responsibilities and priorities of Canadian defense will remain, but for the foreseeable future, our national security work environment is going to be transformed. And by foreseeable future, I mean until a universally deployed vaccine or other remedy to COVID is found. I'd say there's several challenges and in some cases opportunities that present themselves. I'll do this very briefly. We can take it up more broadly in Q&A. But I'd characterize them as evaluating, restarting, and preparing. And on evaluating here, I think, is the issue of sharing experiences. Public health authorities across the region, across the world, are already doing that. But I think militaries as well, forces as well, will be consulting with each other as to how they responded to different demands on their activities, particularly their domestic activities. Restarting, yes, we'll look to restart training domestic operations, but abroad, that's, I think, a question mark. There are challenges of operating with restrictive protocols at home, but these are intensified in thinking about working abroad. Social distancing for defense activities raises a big question mark. You see RIMPAC, for instance, saying that they're going to go forward, but they're going to limit transnational interaction. It's a curious, if you will, notion of multilateral interoperability. And you also then have to think about operating in uncertain environments, interacting with foreign societies or even foreign forces who bring with them the risk of spreading COVID, and how do Canadian forces in those contexts situate themselves, protect themselves, and so on. And preparing, clearly the Canadian domestic governance authorities have to think about how they avoid issues, as you did see in the care facilities in Ontario and Quebec. But more importantly, it's clear that we are portending a second wave, and this may be as early as the fall. And in thinking about that, testing regimes, stockpiling, reorienting operations become a priority. And I assume there's a good bit of thinking about that in the Canadian military already, but it's going to clearly need to be intensified. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian. So before we move to our second round of more formal remarks, I'd like to just throw in a couple of more specific follow-ups on some of what was raised. And the first thing I wanted to ask the panelists about, and I guess that question would be more specifically directed towards Jeff, but other panelists I'm sure will have something to say, is that there are a lot of concerns right now that COVID-19, as Jennifer alluded to, already serves as some kind of a pretext or a way to divert attention away from key strategic developments in the region that have been ongoing, but are now developing in new ways, and that don't necessarily have that much to do with COVID-19 itself, although the fact that they are taking part in that broader context has implications. And of course, I'm thinking about China in particular, which I know is on everyone's minds. We've seen some ongoing strategic developments happening that are worrying in the South China Sea, at the Indian border, with regards to the new national security law in Hong Kong. So I want to ask maybe Jeff to chime in on this, and perhaps other panelists will feel comfortable. Do you think that all of these developments that we're seeing in the Asia-Pacific security landscape right now is a result of COVID-19, or is it the logical prolongation of other factors that are and pre-existing dynamics that have been at play and are just seeing their kind of logical outcome right now? And I want to ask the panelists also about whether you anticipate that these developments that we're seeing in the context of COVID-19, although they're not directly related to it, would you expect fundamentally alter the regional security landscape? So Jeff, perhaps we can start with you, and then if other panelists have something to add to that, we can move to them after.
I mean, I think it's kind of a tricky question to answer. On the one hand, COVID has really, I think, forced almost every state within the region to focus primarily on domestic issues, right? Mostly around the public health space, and then the kind of secondary and tertiary conditions that are coming from the outbreak. So I'd say when you look at what China, the priority is on not only responding to the public health crisis, whether that's in Wuhan or the new outbreak in Beijing or on some border areas with Russia, but it's also making sure that they deal with any resulting domestic instability that might come from those conditions, right? So the priority is on domestic issues. I mean, that primarily is what the Chinese national interest is focused on. First and foremost is domestic stability, right? I mean, we often ascribe Chinese behavior on the foreign, through its foreign policy as being kind of a long-term strategic in ways that the rest of the world, they don't think. The Chinese think on a 10-year, 20-year, 30-year time frame. In many ways, and in most ways, China is much like the rest of the world. They're dealing with their domestic situation first and foremost. That said, you can link foreign policy and security policy back to domestic considerations. And I think that that's no different with COVID than it is with territorial disputes in general times, right? I would not, however, identify all of the issues that you brought up around China as related back to COVID, with maybe the exception of the recent border disputes or skirmishes that have happened between Chinese and Indian troops. That specific issue to me seems like a demonstration, at least on the Chinese side, of control over sovereignty for a domestic audience, to make sure that the Chinese people understand that Beijing hasn't lost sight of its long-term security interests, that the state still maintains its ability to ensure Chinese sovereignty on a national stage, that they're not going to back down, that China won't be bullied, that China will be proactive around securing its strategic space. All of those things, I think, can be tied back to a sense of vulnerability that's kind of creeping into Beijing around its pandemic response. Hong Kong is a different beast. I think that the national security law has its roots. I mean, you can go back to the basic law and then the requirement around Hong Kong legislation to come up with its own national security law, and its failure to do so. It's been, I think about 20 years in the making. So that response, that push for a national security law, at least from Beijing's perspective, was because Hong Kong's own authorities couldn't do it. And then compounding that with last year's 8 months of protests and the inability of the Hong Kong government to bring those protests to heel were all, I think, more important considerations for moving forward with that national security law. South China Sea as well has been an ongoing feature of Chinese foreign policy and security policy for a number of years. I think probably if you're a Chinese strategist and you're looking at the regional space right now, you do see certain opportunities to move certain activities forward because the rest of the region is distracted. But again, I think that we have to look at South China Sea as a longer term strategic issue, Hong Kong as a primarily domestic issue, as I think difficult as that is for a lot of people outside of Hong Kong to accept. But I certainly do think that the Indian-China skirmish on the borders is a little bit of a different beast in that respect. So, I mean, all to say is I think this is primarily a domestic security challenge, but there are opportunities for large states like China that are looking at essentially security vacuums throughout the region and looking to take advantage. Yeah, I'll stop there.
So I'm also sensing that, you know, part of the way that the current context serves as you know, conducive to new opportunities, in particular for China, has a lot to do with another disruption that just has to do not specifically with COVID-19, but with the Trump administration. So going back to Sean, perhaps on that, we know that there is obviously a number of very specific concerns when we think about Asia-Pacific security, when we think about what China's behavior in the region and abroad, that has to do with the specifics of the Trump administration and the situation at the White House. At the same time, Sean's comments alluded to the fact that it's also kind of a, you know, that the Trump administration is not, or maybe a symptom of a broader kind of trend in the way that the United States approached the China question, right? And so we also know that, you know, looking at what you know, regional analysts or policymakers from the region are looking at what's going on with the Trump administration, that, you know, expecting that perhaps a Biden presidency might lead to a return to some kind of normalcy in the way that the United States engages Asia-Pacific strategic issues. And so I wonder what Sean would have to say on that, whether we should, without, you know, predicting too much ahead, right? Because we know that you know, as experts, we've been having issues with that when it comes to the presidential election. But just, you know, giving us a sense of where you expect that a Biden presidency would feature into that broader landscape, Sean. Sean, you're still muted.
There, can you hear me?
Good.
I've got to get into the habit here of checking on that. I think there's no question that a Biden presidency would be an improvement, and it would be more of a return to what Asia Pacific and probably European allies are used to. My concern, as I said before, is that the United States has been going through a process of social and political deterioration for a very long time. You know, this is driven by all sorts of domestic forces. Some of the examples that I didn't mention of, you know, earlier American failure have been, you know, the invasion of Iraq, and putting aside for a moment that invasion was illegal and that it was incredibly disruptive and destabilizing to the region, it was also very incompetently handled. And I think that the fact, you know, that the American government so many years ago was already displaying considerable incompetence in dealing with a major issue is symptomatic of part of this overall deterioration. Now, a Biden presidency probably would not be as incompetent in many different ways, but the problem is that the other political forces within the United States that are present are not going anywhere. So the kinds of things that the United States needs to do in order to deal with, you know, the sorts of weaknesses that have been revealed by the COVID-19 problem require all sorts of different policies in the United States, social welfare policies, health policies, educational policies, all of which are anathema, particularly to conservatives in the United States. They would require a complete revamping of what's going on in the society, a complete reconsideration of the political and social goals of the American state. And while that might happen over time, I would predict, and I'll do a little bit of prediction here, I would predict that that's at least another 10 to 15 years of significant upheaval and dispute and conflict within the United States itself. And while the United States is being fractured and caught up in this tumult, what will be the implications for its foreign policy? Like, will a Biden presidency be able to focus on foreign affairs when there's so much happening at home, when there's so much struggle going on within the borders of the state itself? One of the things that concerns me is that, of course, in the past, American governments have sometimes used foreign affairs as a way to create an outside distraction. And so that wouldn't necessarily happen with the Biden presidency, but it is a possibility of future American governments, turning to foreign affairs as a way to deal with some of their internal, or a distraction from some of their internal problems. So my overall response is that I think that the forces and factors that put Donald Trump in the White House built up over decades, and they're not going to go away overnight. And I think you can see this tension and this deterioration over the period of that whole time. We've generally tended to ignore it. There are lots of American allies, both in Western Europe and in Asia, who really want to look at the United States and they see it through rose-colored glasses or with a lot of wishful thinking. And they want a return to this normalcy that they can recognize. I would point out that the Europeans had a really big problem with the Bush administration. Not as much Asians, but the Europeans definitely did. And now they've had another big problem with the Trump administration. And I think certainly from their perspective, you've got to wonder, is the next Republican president for them going to be another problem? Will the world have to hold its breath every time the United States has an election? Because who's going to be president is going to have an enormous impact on the kind of foreign policy that's followed. And I think there's only so many times you can do that before the rest of the world begins to recognize that, okay, there's an unreliability problem here that has to affect how we consider our relationships with the United States and its status as a reliable player in multiple regions of the world.
And certainly that's been a concern for Asia-Pacific actors and policymakers. This unreliability of the U.S. Partner is actually, as you all know, a very long-standing issue in the region. But that's actually a good segue into what I want to put as a second kind of general question for a general round, and looking at the discussion and bringing back the discussion to Canada more particularly in this very complex context that it needs to navigate. So given the impact of COVID-19 on the Asia-Pacific regional security landscape, what are the implications for Canada when it comes to thinking about how Canada can engage the Asia-Pacific in that very challenging context? What additional challenges does Canada face as a result of COVID-19 regarding its engagement in the region, and what practical recommendations or changes would need to be implemented to Canada's foreign or defense policy to better navigate this context? And I want to ask the panelists to limit their remarks to 2 to 3 minutes so we can have time for discussion with the audience. And let's start with Jennifer Mustafa.
Hi. I think someone's mic isn't muted again.
Yes, Sean, I think your mic is still open. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, okay. So I think it's worth noting, if we're being frank, that for a region that is currently quite captivated by the notion of a middle power moment, potentially, hastened or presented by a post-COVID kind of regional shakeup, Canada doesn't actually seem to be very front of mind for experts, regional experts outside of Canada. So that's something I've noticed, when we listen to regional experts from the region talk about the middle power moment, they're not talking about Canada. And Canada's losing bid for, the Security Council seat, was another wake-up call on this front, which is, I think that, like, bluntly speaking, our vision of ourselves is increasingly out of step with how the world sees us. Now, this can present both challenges and opportunities in relation to the larger region. Canada has an opportunity to strengthen its status as a benign upholder of an Asia-Pacific order or a FOIP, and also foster and diversify links to regional supply chains beyond China, which is something that we're seeing in the ongoing CPTPP ratification and implementation processes. It's worth noting as well, I mean, Sean brought up Europe, but the UK recently, just I think in June, has signaled an interest in joining the CPTPP, partly as a result of Brexit and kind of needing to disentangle themselves from Europe, but of course not looking towards the United States in any meaningful way necessarily. On the other hand, also as Sean mentioned, it is in Canada's interest to decouple its Asia and China policies from those of the Americans. And our moves in the region, I think, will continue to be considerably constrained by the realities of our relationships with the US more generally. The Two Michaels affair, the Huawei extradition affair is an important, unfortunate example of this. So Canada's foreign policy in Asia, including with China, is, for better or for worse, linked inextricably to the challenges of our bilateral relationships with the US. Our concerns, obviously, are not just geostrategic, they're diplomatic, they're economic. You can't talk about geopolitics without talking about the workings of the global economy. We can't talk reasonably about foreign policy without looking at domestic politics. And we can't talk about our Canadian foreign policy with either China or the US without also considering the bigger picture of the relations between them and the rest of the region. So this brings me to kind of something that I've been thinking about a little bit more lately, which is one possibility to consider for Canada, is that if we are increasingly being regarded as just one of the many, as opposed to holding some sort of leadership status in the world or in the region, maybe it's worthwhile to pay attention to some of our common interests with other East Asian actors as we all navigate the increasingly precarious relationship that's emerging between the US and China. So that's something that I would maybe think about as a concrete piece of advice for people, formulating foreign policy, thinking about these things, is that just like many of the actors in Southeast Asia, in East Asia, who aren't China, we are also navigating these tricky tightrope relationships between the two countries and in our relationships with them. So I would leave it there.
I want to turn to Brian Job now because he set the stage very well for a discussion of Canada, looking at the impact of COVID-19 on the Canadian military and how it does things mostly domestically, right? But there are implications for Canadian engagement in defense diplomacy in the Asia-Pacific region. And I wonder if Brian would have something to say about, how Canada should approach this question.
Thanks, Stephanie. I'll try to keep this real brief, given what I take to be the impatience of our audience. I see 2 points here. The question of engagement with the Asia-Pacific and Asia-Pacific security environment depends on 2 dimensions. One, I would characterize as political and strategic interest and will. There's no doubt that Asia and Asia security developments are going to sustain or even increase their relevance to Canadian economic and security interests. The region is becoming more complex. It's a more difficult operational environment. And to date, Canada has looked to maintain a limited but relevant presence, sanction enforcement, multilateral forums and exercises, showing the flags and so on. But having pulled back, largely because of COVID, whether or not we're going to be able and interested in sustaining or increasing our engagement in that of the Canadian forces, I think is a very open question. We've looked in the past to multilateral institutional engagement, but one sees very little energy on this front in regional fora. I can't find any reference to, for instance, the ARF and so on. Instead, I think we have to look to, and Jennifer was on to this point, we have to look to cooperation with the like-minded on similar interests. And that's going to vary, I think, bilaterally with different countries and different issues. And that's the first point, is whether or not we actually are going to have the energy and the political will directed from Ottawa towards re-engagement, let alone increasing engagement. The second point is, the second dimension on sustaining Canadian engagement is, to be blunt, following the money. The bottom line for this is funding. The SSC advanced a very ambitious agenda of necessary spending to position the forces for the future, but will the government sustain these commitments, especially of big ticket items? The Canadian defense budget is the largest discretionary portion of federal spending, and historically, in economic hard times, it has taken deep cuts. One already sees senior members of the Canadian forces raising concerns about what may be, in fact, the efforts or the necessity of Ottawa to cut back significantly, postpone, delay, even cancel big ticket items. And these decisions are going to have a significant impact on our capacities to engage in the region.
Thank you, Brian. Now moving to Sean Narayan. Anything you have to add to that, Sean, when it comes to how Canada should approach its engagement with the region right now?
Not too much. I agree with both what Brian and Jennifer said. I guess I would say that one of the things we need to do in Canada, perhaps, is start rethinking exactly what kind of state we are. Like, we're a relatively small state with a certain position in the international system. We've been very Atlantic oriented for most of our history, for all of our history, in fact. And the time may have come to simply say, well, look, our future is with another part of the world, and we still need to start thinking about how to be a smaller country working with other like-minded states outside of our traditional Western alliance commitments. And I think this is something we need to rethink much more carefully. If, God forbid, there's another Trump presidency come the end of this year, NATO will be all but over. And that's an interesting question to wonder. And like, given how oriented Canada's security has been towards things like NATO, what do we do and what do we say and how do we think of ourselves in a non-NATO world? And so that's one of those things that we can throw out there.
Thank you. And then I guess the last word for that round would be to Jeff Reeves before we turn to the Q&A. So I'll ask the audience to start thinking about their questions. I'm sure they do already. Jeff?
I have very little to add to what already I think was a really excellent discussion about this. The only thing that I would caution is the marching orders to look for like-minded states. And I think that when you define what does it mean when we talk about like-minded states, I think we need to parse that out a little bit, because on the one hand, there's a tendency to look towards foreign affairs and security relations from a value perspective. And I think doing that, there's a very, I think, strong pull for Canadian alignment with the Indo-Pacific concepts, in particular coming out of the United States, Japan, Australia, and India. But I do think that it's worth taking a step back and saying, making sure that we're not aligning with specific visions of order and specific visions of state relationships and a whole litany of different value propositions and strategic views that don't fit with Canada's national interests. So I do think that already, we've seen the Prime Minister use the Indo-Pacific construct at least twice in speeches with Japanese and Indian counterparts. I just counsel caution there, because when you do kind of deconstruct these concepts, they are pretty problematic, particularly when you look at what the United States is advocating through this Indo-Pacific concept. Getting back to some of the issues that Sean has raised, I think, really eloquently here. So just treading lightly. And in terms of Japan, I would even counsel caution that the Indo-Pacific concept will continue beyond the Abe administration, because I think it's very, very important to identify the Abe administration for being what it is. And that's a rather kind of not a typically normal Japanese administration, in the fact that Abe has a much more cosmopolitan worldview than other Japanese prime ministers. So there is a very good likelihood once he's no longer prime minister, Japan will refocus on its domestic issues rather than trying to become a normal country in terms of its security relations in the Asia Pacific. So just counsel caution in that respect.
Thank you, Jeff. Excellent point. So we're now moving to the Q&A portion of the webinar. So we do have about 30 minutes left for questions from the audience and engagement with the panelists. I do have one question lined up already. So that's a question from Ian Kennedy. And the question, which I believe was initially directed at Jeff, but perhaps other panelists will have something to add to this as well, is do you see any worrisome power shifts or monetary investment due to COVID with regards to the long-term resource drains in terms of healthcare, keeping the economy alive, or the government business's ability to borrow? And there was also a kind of a quick follow-up to that, which had to do with the brain drain from Asia, driving a wedge between classes domestically. So I think that ties in with your interest at the interconnection between the economy and security implications of COVID-19 pretty nicely.
Absolutely, and I'll do my best to answer that. I mean, I think there's some fundamental trends that are happening across the Asia Pacific in terms of the political economy with relation back to COVID, right? Most fundamentally, I think this this COVID crisis is going to mean a return to extreme poverty for hundreds of millions of people at the global level, but also, of course, within the Asia Pacific. For example, India, there's a massive implications around the COVID response, the pandemic response, in terms of limitation of movement and in terms of shutting down key sections of the economy that will have long-term effects on the most vulnerable parts of those countries' populations. And we see those, of course, disproportionately affecting women and children and the elderly. So the World Food Program came out just, I think, either yesterday or the day before, saying it's quite likely that more people will die from hunger during this pandemic than actually will die from COVID-19. And I think that that is very, very relevant to the Asia-Pacific context when you look at developing countries like, again, India, Indonesia, other countries with large populations with particularly vulnerable people. So that's one area I think that's very important to touch on. The other is I think that it will drive an increasing division between rich and poor states, and then rich and poor individuals within those states. States like Singapore, economies like Taiwan have been able to, I think, really effectively marshal their domestic tools to respond to COVID, and have set themselves, I think, on a good course for recovery. But that's been very resource intensive. In particular, coming up with economic strategies to deal with the dislocation of people that have lost their jobs because of COVID, or people that have had to go on hiatus from their work. And not all states in the region have been able to do that equally, right? So we're going to see, I think, a growing gap between the states that were already somewhat moving towards development or developed states in the region versus those that were moving into a developing state status that are now finding their progress erased, essentially. At the state level, I think we're going to see an increased amount of sovereign and domestic debt. There's already a lot of discussions around debt forgiveness. And I think this is one area where China could potentially really solidify its reputation within the region, and has already been talking about how it's going to approach this, right? So through the Belt and Road Initiative, there's been a lot of loans and concessional loans and non-concessional loans going to developing countries, whether in the Asia Pacific or in Africa or in other parts of the developing world. Stepping forward and saying that they're open to debt forgiveness or postponement of payment will, I think, very much put China in a position to demonstrate at least that it's providing a degree of public goods that are so critical to these states' long-term economic, I think, sustainability. And then, of course, the issue of debt sustainability at the national level is going to be an implication for Canada as much as any other country in the region. We've had to spend significant amounts of money to deal with this crisis, and ultimately those payments will come due. It's going to be easier for some states to deal with that, but that will become, I think, a problem for many developing states in the Asian region. I think there's also going to be a very strong push away from globalization within the Asia Pacific towards localization. You've already seen, for example, Japan coming out and saying that it's going to push its companies towards kind of localizing their supply chains to minimize the amount of risk. I think supply chain reevaluation and management is going to be a big issue going forward. You've already seen Canadian firms thinking about the need for diversification to move outside of China, for instance. I mean, these things they have long runways in terms of actually implementing, but they also have pretty significant, I think, impacts for economic relations between states. And I think then the last thing I would say is that it would be very interesting to see how many Canadian companies remain active within the Asia Pacific. So my foundation does an investment monitor where we look at the amounts of Canadian investment going into the Asia Pacific. And right now we're talking through the need to develop a counterpoint disinvestment monitor, because what we are afraid that we're seeing is that the challenges in the Asia Pacific, the restructuring of supply chains, the less than welcoming domestic economies, the prioritization of national companies over international companies are all going to make the Asia Pacific and many economies less welcoming to foreign direct investment than in the past. And we've actually already seen some countries stepping forward and limiting foreign direct investment right now out of concern for their domestic companies and domestic champions. And yeah, I think maybe that's the main points that I'd raise with respect to those issues.
Very comprehensive answer. I want to give the opportunity to the other panelists to maybe add to that very quickly if they have anything to add to the very broad list of interaction between the economy and the security implications of COVID that you just mentioned. But perhaps there's something still missing. So I wonder if for other panelists, no, Sean seems satisfied. Brian doesn't have anything to add either. So let's move to a second question from the audience, and that comes from Besma. I believe this is Besma Malani from the University of Waterloo and head of the DSF group. She has a question, and I want to just mention briefly that unfortunately we don't have a South Asian expert on the panel. We do have one on the team, just not on this panel. So with that caveat, the question from Besma is about what happened with the skirmishes between China and India at the border. So we've seen a lot of reports coming from India, right, on the numbers of Indian soldiers killed, et cetera, but not much in terms of the impact on China and how China might approach the issue moving forward. So I wonder if any one of our panelists would have something to say on that.
I can make a couple of quick comments. I suspect Jeff will come in on this. I think if you look at that situation, each side is playing up this incident for its domestic purposes. And therefore in India, you report on the casualties that the nasty Chinese have inflicted on you, and you build the animosity towards China. And in China, you report on Indian casualties, assume that you haven't taken any of your own, to basically heighten what appears to be the capacity and the chutzpah of the Chinese military and its sovereignty protectionist agenda. It's a very odd situation because by and large these forces were fighting each other without the usual equipment of military forces, and we're literally talking hand-to-hand combat.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think there's a relatively kind of, and I hesitate to say this because I could be proven wrong tomorrow. There's a relatively stable quality around the situation right now. And I think that comes, number one, because once China did demonstrate, I think, to its domestic audience that it had taken these measures, there was a step back from reporting within domestic media around this issue. It wasn't raised to the level of a national interest like you see, for example, around the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands that can dominate discussions on talk shows or media. We saw a step away, at least, from the state-controlled media to stop reporting on this issue once the Chinese had demonstrated their resolve. On the other hand, the Modi administration stepped forward and essentially responded by canceling a number of Chinese apps, particularly TikTok, that had almost 200 million users in India, as a way of demonstrating their own strategic resolve. But I think it was a very clever thing that the Modi administration did, because that actually inflicted very minimal cost on Beijing, while demonstrating a clear purpose to the Indian domestic audience. So we've gotten to a point where the Modi administration, through its response, has somewhat de-escalated the situation, despite the fact that there are still significant numbers of troops on both sides of the border. But of course, that situation, again, is decades old and is certainly nothing new, and has been managed pretty successfully in the past through buffer zones and regions that have allowed the troops to interact with each other and then retreat strategically back to their outposts. But I mean, I think, again, it was an instance from the Chinese side of demonstrating strategic control, demonstrating Chinese power, demonstrating the ability of Beijing to ensure overseas national interests or interests related to domestic sovereignty at a time of the pandemic response. So hopefully this was just a flare up that can go back to a status quo ante, where it's basically just now a bunch of troops standing eyeball to eyeball in certain instances, but both sides acting with some restraint.
Thank you both. So before we get to the next question, I just want to remind the audience that if you do want to ask a question, you can type in your question in the Q&A section at the bottom right of your screen, and I will convey your question to the panelists. So the next question that we have is actually about, I guess, or significant or most relevant other when it comes to engagement in the Asia-Pacific security landscape. So it's a question about Australia, and it comes from Paul Chamberlain. And the question is, what is your reaction to the recent Australian strategic defense update? Is it a sea change in outlook, a recognition of Australia's vulnerabilities, and therefore a requirement for greater military capabilities? What has been the regional reaction? And I guess I would add, where does Canada fit into that in comparison? Is there a volunteer perhaps on either Sean or Jennifer? Jennifer, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not an Australia expert. I'm assuming that the question asker was referring to the fact that Australia is ramping up to increase its spending and its defense capabilities moving forward. I mean, something that really, comes to mind there is that, Australia's major sort of military ally continues to be the United States. This has already been perceived by some as a perhaps effort to rely less on the United States, in response to threats from the region, which, we all know is China. And I think, once again, we're sort of back to that commonality theme, perhaps, which is that the other actors in the region, in the Asia-Pacific region that aren't China or the US, continue to have to navigate this kind of relationship that they have with the two countries and that the two countries have with each other. So that would just be my very, kind of quick response, just based on what I know about it.
Anything to add from the other panelists? Is there an interest to engage with that question?
There's an interest. It could be a long discussion.
It could be.
And I'd be happy to engage with you, Paul, afterwards on this. Is it a sea change in outlook? No, I think it's an attempt to sustain the momentum that has been built between the Australian defense community and its political forces at the moment, which are decidedly and increasingly anti-Chinese, in order then to sustain what is really a remarkable increase. It's premised on two things, I think, which I think are both questionable. One is, maybe not the first, but one is a sustained uptick in the Australian economy. You couldn't possibly see this amount of spending go forward if the economy stalls in any way. The second is the paradox of Australia depending on China as its largest export market, and at the same time attempting to portray it as its largest threat and associate itself increasingly with the United States. I think it's something that we need to watch. I frankly don't see an equivalent in Canada. I don't see, for instance, any major uptake beyond what is already supposedly committed to defense funding in Canada?
I have a somewhat different view that I can quickly articulate. I do think it is a bit of a sea change. And I think that if you look at, for example, the dialogue that's been coming out of Australian defense papers and foreign policy white papers, there's been a much more focus on integration of Australia into regional economies, regional security relationships, the expanding and diversification of Australian ties away, of course, prioritizing its alliance with the United States as the keystone and the foundation of its security foreign policy. But at the same time, arguing for greater integration of Australia into the Asia Pacific. I think this strategic update does reprioritize the region around great power conflict in line with the vision that's coming out of the US right now. So I think the Morrison administration has moved away from a more inclusive view of the Asia Pacific for Australia and is much more in line with the view coming out of the Trump administration, which sees most of the instability coming from the Asia Pacific as emanating from Chinese activity. So I would say that, yeah, I do think that it's a different way of thinking about this. You can actually, follow in terms of textual analysis, a very different view of the region. This strategic update wasn't, I don't necessarily think mandated either. I think their next defense white paper was due in 2022. And so it just goes, I think, to show the sense from the Morrison administration that coming out with a clearly articulated vision of the Asia Pacific that fits very closely with the United States one was seen as, I think, a strategic necessity at this point in time.
We have two questions.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to add.
Oh, go ahead, Sean. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm not an Australian expert either, but I mean, a couple of things about that. Sort of building on what Paul just said, I think that, if push comes to shove, and this may be somewhat difficult to sort of fully articulate, but if push comes to shove, if ASEAN countries, the Southeast Asian countries as an example, are forced to choose between the United States and China, and they absolutely don't want to, but if they have to make that choice, they will look at China and they will say, China is always going to be here. Whereas, the reliability of the United States has been, as Stephanie was mentioning, a concern for quite a long time. And they will ultimately make their peace with China, whatever that may look like. So it sounds to me like in some ways, Australia is running the risk of isolating itself within the region and putting itself on a very precarious kind of footing. Even Japan with its FOIP is much more restrained in how it deals with China than anything coming out of the Americans or perhaps the Australians. So I'd be curious to see how much this Australian change, if it is a change, continues to be maintained after Scott Morrison is gone.
And I would even say the Japanese are going in the opposite direction, where they started with a much more strategic view of the Indo-Pacific and have realigned to be much more inclusive and even articulated their desire to overlap their FOIP vision with China's BRI when and where it makes sense.
Yes, and in many,
Jen had a quick thought to that.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just my very quick thought as well, just to add to all of this, is that we also have to consider Australian domestic politics, right? So that strategic update is also for its domestic audience, and I think that's an important consideration as well. And I don't think it takes away from any of the points that have been made.
Sean, just a very brief additional thought, because we do have a couple of questions lined up, and we have 10 minutes left.
I understand. I was just going to add to the earlier point that one of the reasons Japan began moderating its FOIP is because it got feedback from Southeast Asian countries. And so that speaks to that importance.
Thank you. So we have two questions coming in on China. So the first one is from Brian Miller, and it has to do with China's COVID-19 diplomacy. How effective has it been, in your opinion, if at all? And because what we've seen a unity of rhetoric and in some cases action from U.S. allies in response to Hong Kong, in some expression of support for Taiwan as well. So how effective is China's current public diplomacy or diplomacy in general in the context of COVID-19? but with regards to these developments as well in Hong Kong and Taiwan. Any volunteer to tackle that question?
Well, I guess I'll just take a quick shot, because earlier I had said that I didn't think China's diplomacy was as effective as it could be. And then, of course, I was given a very good reason from Jeff for believing that I might be wrong. I think that, yes, in the Western world, China has certainly not made much headway. I think the real question would be, outside the Western world, how effective has diplomacy been? And I think there you sort of get at some of the issues that Jeff raised, which is that China is seen as having been effective. You know, it dealt with the COVID-19 crisis in a very draconian, very powerful way, but it seems to have it under control. And so from that point of view, if it's true the soft power depends in large part on what works, the Chinese can make a credible case that they work. Now their methods may not be the kind of thing you could apply everywhere in the world. It takes resources, it takes all sorts of things that many countries don't have. But as a demonstration effect, it's quite powerful, I think.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts on that? Yes, Jeff?
I think that, I mean, you kind of, I agree with Sean on that point. I think, on the other hand, I think there have been fits and starts, in particular when there was a rush to China to become the global supplier of, PPE, and it moved a little bit too fast, too early. It sent defective masks that were ultimately returned. It was seen as hoarding some supplies, and I think there's a concern that if there is a second wave, that China is essentially the single country in the world that is producing a lot of the PPE that many countries need, and of course it will prioritize the use of that domestically rather than exporting them abroad. So I think that being a supplier of public goods during the COVID crisis didn't work well for China, although it tried, and it certainly was the only major power out there doing that at the time. So that, I think, did increase its standing to a degree. I think that this move by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs coming out of China to be more assertive in what they're calling wolf warrior diplomacy has had a huge negative return in terms of regional perspective, international perspectives. But to China's credit, I think that they're dialing that back a little bit after hearing that it hasn't gone over well in many economies or countries across the world. I think that again, China has learned a bit of a lesson in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, where it came out quite cocksure and very much feeling its swagger on the international level from affecting a relatively successful response at that time. To see the rest of the world kind of shrink back from what they would see as Chinese assertion, I think it's learned its lesson right now and is being a little bit more measured in the way that it's engaging. At the same time, I do think there's a sense within China that it's done better than other countries, and they want to do kind of a victory lap. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
If I may add, there's not only an international backlash against wolf warrior diplomacy, but from what I get, there's also kind of a domestic controversy as well between different generations of Chinese diplomats who have very different perspectives on how China should engage in public diplomacy moving forward. So that's also an interesting development in looking at, the risks and the challenges that come from seeing China kind of this big black coherent bloc, right, when it comes to its foreign policy. We have another question more specifically on the BRI, which is something that was alluded to by the panel previously. So the question comes from Josh Pryor. Do you think China will be utilizing more lease takeovers such as key infrastructure? And sorry, the Q&A just disappeared on me for some reason. Okay, key infrastructures such as the China-backed ports in other countries in need of funds due to COVID-19 as part of its Belt and Road Initiative. So going back to the impact of COVID-19 on the Belt and Road Initiative. Any volunteer from the panel? I'm looking at Jeff, I guess, but perhaps there are others. I know you're over-solicited right now.
No, I think it's important up front to answer that question with the caveat that having asset-backed loans to developing parts of the world is not a uniquely Chinese development. It's something that European and American companies have done in Africa for many, many years. When you do go and finance a high-risk loan, using assets as essentially a loan guarantee is not uncommon. That said, China obviously has done this in the past. I do think that there is a bit of a misnomer around this idea of debt trap diplomacy, where China purposefully goes forward and uses its loans and then receives asset-backed guarantees against its loans with the understanding that it hopes those loans default so that it can take control of those assets. I think that's very, very overplayed. There's not a lot of data or evidence out there that suggests that, other than the 1 or 2 cases that are always raised around the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, the port in Gwadar port, I think in Pakistan perhaps, are these instances where China has tried to use loans to get access to overseas bases or ports. So I would just caution, yeah, probably that will continue as China goes forward and provides financing to small and developing countries. Their assets are oftentimes the only loan guarantees that they're able to give forward. But again, I don't think that's a uniquely Chinese approach to provision. And I would just counsel not kind of lumping Chinese activity into this narrative that China is doing something that other countries aren't.
Sean, I see you nodding. I wonder if you have anything to add on that. You're good. All right. We do have another question coming from Matthew Willis from D&D. Interested in the panel's views on the suggestion that Japan's posture towards China would revert after Abe departs. Will the region's geopolitics allow Japan's next leader to re-embrace the pacifist tradition?
I could think.
Jeff again.
So, listen, Abe is from a unique party within the Japanese political system that is much more hawkish than the mainstream view. And I do think that when you do travel to Tokyo and you travel through Tokyo, there's almost perennial protests outside the Ministry of Foreign Affairs against some of the things that Abe is trying to do. Revise Article 9 so that Japan can be more proactive overseas, to make Japan a more normal country in terms of its security and foreign policy. However, I genuinely don't think that those are desires that are widely held within Japanese public opinion. If you do look at opinion polls, not many Japanese citizens or the Japanese population are all that enthusiastic about Japan assuming a larger role overseas with respect to its security policy. So I do think the Abe administration is unique in that respect. The next prime minister, whoever he or she may be, will most likely, unless they are a direct protege of Abe, will more likely have a narrow aperture to look at Japan's interests. And that, in my opinion, will most likely fall back on the Asia Pacific, not necessarily to redefine the Indo-Pacific. India is a huge important partner for Japan, securing the sea lines of communication in the Indian Ocean for the sake of energy security to Japan. Those things won't go away. So I think that there's probably going to be a continuation of the Indo-Pacific nomenclature moving into a next administration. But I don't think that there are many individuals standing behind Abe with the potential of moving into the prime minister slot who share his individual views of China, or excuse me, of Japan's position within not only the region, but at a global level. I think there will probably be a degree of walk back in terms of its security and foreign policy relations.
Thank you. So yes, Sean,
sorry,
very quickly, because we're already over time.
So I was going to say, I generally agree with what Jeff said, but I do think that the younger Japanese are beginning to change their attitude somewhat towards China. And I think there's more room in Japan now for the idea of Japan as a normal country, not necessarily a country that's going to be aggressive or particularly overly assertive in its role in the region, but one that will be less constrained and more open to the possibility of playing a larger role. I think historically Japan has been interested in playing a larger leadership role. They've just been fairly subtle about it. I'll just stop there.
Thank you very much. So unfortunately, this is all the time that we have for today, and we already covered a very broad spectrum of issues, countries, and implications. So I really want to thank our four panelists for enlightening us this way and covering that broad spectrum with us. If you wish to be kept in the loop of our future activities, please visit the DSF Group website, register to our newsletter, and after what